It's an honor for me to be here. I grew up in the Marine Corps. My dad was a career officer. He retired as a colonel of Marines, and Camp Lejeune was part of my upbringing. It's very nice to be back, even if I didn't get barbecue for lunch. What I'd like to do today is just take 10 minutes to kind of set up the conversation that I'm very honored to have with two distinguished governors of the state of North Carolina and with our moderator, David. And I'm going to start by talking a little about the challenges in the world that we need to address. And then I'll talk very quickly about some innovations and some ways we can alleviate some of the security challenges and how that fits together: diplomacy, defense, and development. Let me begin by looking back, if I can, because it's important to understand 21st century security by looking at 20th century security. So I'll begin by taking you 100 years in the past and introducing you to the graduating class of a French military academy, the West Point of France, a place called Saint-Cyr. It's the spring of 1914 in this photograph. These are very highly spirited young men. They know war is coming in Europe. They vow they will go into battle wearing their white gloves, and they do. This is 1914. By 1918, everybody in this photograph is dead. Everybody. This is 20th century security. We didn't learn much in the course of World War I and World War II, global conflagrations that consumed perhaps 100 million lives around the world. What do we try and do to create further security in the 20th century? We built walls. We built them everywhere. We built on the idea of the Maginot Line and the Schlieffen Plan of World War I and World War II, and we created the Iron Curtain, the Bamboo Curtain, this photograph, the Berlin Wall, the demilitarized zone. 20th century security was about building walls, and in essence, it failed. So when did this all occur to me? It occurred to me on 9/11 when I was in the Pentagon, and that little red circle is my office in the Pentagon. And I saw the airplane hit the Pentagon. So here I was, a newly selected one-star admiral at the time, in the safest building in the world, in the greatest city, the capital of the strongest nation in the world. Was I safe? Obviously not. I realized that building walls will not create security in this 21st century. You have to build bridges. And that's my thesis for us today, and I think is really essentially the theme of this wonderful organization: how we can build bridges to create security. So I'll just take 3 minutes and walk you around the world, because the world is still a pretty dangerous place as you scan the horizon. And I'll start with violent extremism. We call it terrorism. Terrorism is really a tactic. The motivations for the violence vary. This is a Taliban court in Afghanistan. Upon conclusion of the court, you can watch this online in a video. You see the voice saying, "She is guilty of adultery. You must execute her. You are her husband." And the husband picks up a rifle and shoots his wife in the back of the head 8 times. This is violent extremism. It's not confined, of course, to Afghanistan. Next door in Pakistan, this heroic young girl, Malala, you must have heard of her. She was pulled off a school bus because she advocated for girls' education, and the Pakistani Taliban shot her in the head and neck. Miraculously, she survived. You see her on the left side of the screen as she is today. She was the runner-up for the Nobel Peace Prize. I fearlessly predict she will win it one day. Malala said, "They tried to silence me by killing me, and out of the silence, thousands of voices emerged." This is violent extremism. And before we tend to pigeonhole it as a phenomena of Afghanistan and Pakistan and Central Asia, where we have been focused for this last decade, this is Europe. This very handsome young man, upper right, is a Norwegian named Anders Breivik. 2 summers ago, he set off a bomb and blew up the government house in Oslo, killing 7 people. Then he took 2 high-powered rifles, put them on his back, went to a small gathering of young men and women between the ages of 18 and 22, kind of like girl state, boy state here in the United States, and he killed 77 of them. Now that's a horrific act in any dimension, but it's worth knowing the population of Norway is 5 million. On a population-adjusted basis, this act of violent extremism would be as though in the United States we had 4,500 young people killed in a single day. This is violent extremism. Walls will not stop this. We ought to also worry about countries that live outside of international norms, like Iran. Now, we're at a mildly hopeful moment with Iran. I'm skeptical, but willing to listen as we try to negotiate them away from weapons of mass destruction. But nations like Iran, who exist outside the norms of international behavior, are part of the challenges of this 21st century. North Korea, equally so. They already have weapons of mass destruction, of course. And Syria, where we see a terrible civil war raging, which has thus far killed 120,000 people. Weapons of mass destruction here are being destroyed by the United Nations. That's a good thing. But these nations like Iran, Syria, North Korea, who exist outside of international norms, will not be deterred by walls. We also ought to worry about the movement of narcotics, weapons, cash, individuals who are smuggled, violent extremists. This is a photograph of a semi-submersible built in the Colombian jungle, which had, when we captured it, 10 tons of cocaine in it. Poppy, which creates heroin, flows from Afghanistan through the Caucasus, through Western Europe, and here to the United States. So these trafficking routes are also part of international security. And again, our walls, our attempt to stop them in that sense, are not working. We ought to worry about pirates. This is more than just an occasional incident. Maybe some of you saw the marvelous movie Captain Phillips. You see these Somali pirates. This is a $10 billion discontinuity in the global transportation grid. And part of it is the movement of humans, many of whom are smuggled in human trafficking schemes. And in these slipstreams of narcotics, piracy, and the movement of both legal and illegal migrants can move these violent extremists, making it, again, more difficult to stop things. We ought to also be concerned about the environment, which is causing new shipping routes to open in the north, and environmental disasters like the one that struck the Gulf Coast several years ago. Finally, we ought to think about cyber, and walls will not stop cyber attack in the end. So at this point, you ought to say, well, Jim, that's quite a list. That's pretty worrisome. So what do you think? What should we be doing about it? And that's what I'd like to talk about in principle today. Now, this is a whimsical photograph. If you look closely, you see it's someone listening. This is actually a Belgian defense system of about 100 years ago. But I put it there as a metaphor. The first thing we ought to do is listen more. We ought to spend a little less time transmitting and a little more time listening to others and learning about their culture, their history. Why does a Somali man decide to get in a little skiff, rattle around at sea, risking his life to conduct piracy? What is behind that? We also ought to take time to think. In addition to listening, we ought to try and find time in our very busy lives to build intellectual capital. This is a photograph of the Naval War College. Every year, the Navy sends a group of officers, Navy, Marine Corps, we have Air Force and Army, they come to a war college, and they spend time disconnecting to learn, to listen, to build intellectual capital. And I think that's part of 21st century security, as is reading. And we should be reading biography and history and autobiography and political science. And as the the dean of the Fletcher School, I'm making sure my students are doing that. We also ought to be reading novels. We ought to read fiction in order to understand culture and history. Here are a few books I've been reading lately. Orphan Master's Son, Pulitzer Prize winner, about North Korea and its dystopian culture. Matterhorn, the story of a young Marine's first 60 days in combat in Vietnam. Its counterinsurgency turned upside down. The Circle is a new novel about the cyber world and about the social networks. And the Afghan campaign is a novel, not about the current NATO campaign in Afghanistan, not about the Soviet campaign, not about the British campaigns in Afghanistan. It's about the first campaign, Alexander the Great's. And the lessons you can learn in this novel about Pashtun culture ring true today. Point being, in order to face these challenges of the 21st century, we need more time, frankly, in gatherings like this, where we listen, we learn, we connect, we build intellectual bridges to understand other cultures vastly better. We ought to study languages more. This is a young Canadian sergeant who is teaching himself Pashto in Afghanistan. To know another language is to know another culture, to know another life. And in the Department of Defense, as an example, an organization that lives in the global world, only 8% of our men and women speak a second language. We should learn languages to seek to connect more effectively. And a different kind of language altogether. Now, you look at this and you probably say, it's an admiral up there talking. These are probably sea lanes of communication, or they're underwater cables and grids of our fiber optics. No, this is Facebook. This is the world according to Facebook. The brighter the white light, the higher the concentration of connection. And we all know the 6 largest countries in the world, right? It's China, India, Facebook, the United States, Twitter, which is on feed, and Indonesia. Now, we laugh. I gave a presentation like this in the United Kingdom several years ago when I was the Supreme Allied Commander at NATO. And I got to this point in the presentation and I said, I'm on Facebook, friend me. And got a little bit of a little reaction in the room, but there was a reporter in the back of the room who wrote an article on the AP Wire, and the headline was, Supreme Allied Commander Needs Friends, which I undoubtedly do. And the article, because it was an AP Wire story, only ran in 2 places. It ran, weirdly, in Finland and Indonesia. The next morning, I had hundreds of friend requests from Finns and Indonesians. Most of them said, Admiral, I heard you need a friend. What is NATO? And we should laugh at that, but we should also realize the power in these social nets to create bridges, to create understanding. All of those emails gave me and my team a chance to answer, talk about NATO, a global force for good. So connection is important in this world. And a very different kind of connection is unfolding in the world I live in now as the dean of a graduate school of international relations. And we're here in the triangle of one of the great university centers in the world. And Coursera, which is a new kind of online ability to deliver education, is holding courses today with enrollments of 30,000, 40,000, 50,000, including Pakistani teenagers learning physics from Stanford professors. The ability to use the internet to deliver education, I think, will profoundly reshape the global environment. That is another powerful kind of connection, a bridge that creates security. Alliances matter. NATO, I would argue, continues to matter, as do our alliances. So these kind of geopolitical bridges. NATO, in the end, is a bridge in time. It connects us with a Cold War past. NATO is a cultural bridge of 28 nations, and it's a transatlantic bridge representing the connections of the United States with our European partners. Alliances are bridges. They are part of 21st century security. We've talked a little bit about the tsunami in the Pacific. This is a beautiful Navy ship. This one is the Comfort, which is the East Coast hospital ship. On the West Coast today, the Mercy, her sister ship, is giving assistance in the Philippines. These ships are not manned just by the Navy. There are plenty of Navy people, but there are lots of private-public connections. These ships sail with Operation Smile, Doctors Without Borders, Project Hope. Dozens and dozens of different NGOs come to sea on these, as well as international partners. These are ships that are bridges, international, interagency, and private-public. And the treatments they do are extraordinary. I had the privilege of seeing one in Nicaragua where a mother had walked with her son for 3 days to come to the eye clinic. He was maybe 6 years old, and she described his symptoms as he can't see. Everything is terribly blurry. Now, the 1/3 of you in this room who are like I am, simply myopic, understand that. The doctor put a pair of glasses on this little boy for the first time in his life, and he looked up and could see every leaf in the tree. And he said, "Mama, veo el mundo." Mom, I see the world. Now multiply that times 400,000 patient treatments, and you create a very different impression of the United States of America and our partners in a country like Nicaragua, where we have not always enjoyed high degree of popularity and prestige. All of a sudden, we are compassionate, we're competent, we're professional. This is very much part of creating security, this kind of humanitarian work and disaster relief. I'll give you a different example in a different part of the world, Afghanistan. These are Afghan soldiers, and they have books. And you should say, well, that's odd. I thought Afghan soldiers were largely illiterate. And you'd be correct. Afghans in this demographic didn't receive education. The Taliban withheld it. So why do the Afghan soldiers have books? The answer is they're in literacy class. We are teaching them to read. We, the United States, we, NATO, we, private-public partners who are part of this literacy effort. And this is the most profound bridge you can create, is a bridge to knowledge, a bridge to the world. In Afghanistan, if you're a literate man or woman, you put a pen in your pocket so others can see it and know that you're literate. And in Afghanistan, when they graduate from this course, we give them a pen and they put it in your pocket. And you should be at one of these ceremonies to see a young Afghan woman or man put that pen in their pocket for the first time. This creates security. We've taught 400,000 Afghan security forces to read and write in Afghanistan. And frankly, we ought to harness the power of women in international relations. This is a long conversation, but in so many places, women are undervalued, shut out. I was so taken with the example we showed earlier of the garden where the woman's part is growing so much better. I mean, is that a metaphor for everything? Certainly my wife would say so. We need to find ways to create bridges across genders, and I think that's part of 21st century security as well. I'll close with a couple final thoughts. Here's a very heroic young man, because we should remember that at the end of the day, the best bridge you can build is a personal one. It's personal contact, which trumps everything. This young man was named Michael Murphy. He's a 1989 graduate of Penn State. He became a Navy SEAL. Michael was killed in Afghanistan several years ago, where he won the Medal of Honor. And he won it, and there's a long story associated with this, but essentially he made a decision that protected Afghan civilians. He chose not to kill a group of Afghan civilians. And eventually, we believe, caused his team to be attacked later on. Michael was a very heroic Navy SEAL in every dimension. He's now, as you can see by that ship coming out behind him, a Navy ship is named after Michael Murphy. I put him there to remind us that in the midst of all this wonderful technology and our ability to move messages and teach on the internet and use social networks, young men and women like Michael Murphy are the absolute essence of our security and of our compassion as a nation as well. So I'll close by a reminder I've spoken a lot today about what many of you in the audience might think of as soft power. It's really smart power. I'll make that point in a moment. But without the ability to conduct hard power operations, soft power is not going to be effective. I would not want anyone to walk out of here today with any doubt about the capability of the U.S. military to conduct combat operations. Here you see a Navy destroyer launching a Tomahawk missile. We are very, very good at combat operations when we're called upon to do so. We're good at launching Tomahawks. We need to get better, the big we, all of us, at launching ideas. So we've talked about smart power and hard power, and I'd make the point that it's not an on and off switch. The idea is not to go into combat or just sit in the barracks. Life, in so many ways, is not an on and off switch. We know this in our lives. Life is a rheostat that you dial in. So where you go on that dial between hard power, which sometimes you need, and soft power, which is very important, that dial, that's smart power. It's that ability to move on the dial. So last slide. This is Wikipedia, a wonderful company, one that I certainly jump on every day, looking up facts and figures. I'm sure everybody does here as well. Wikipedia is a perfect example of the fact that no one of us is as smart as all of us together. Wikipedia, as you know, is this online encyclopedia, and it's not created by 12 really smart people in a room. It's created by all of us. Every day, tens of thousands of people input information into Wikipedia, and every day, millions of people draw it out. Everybody thinking together is so much smarter than any one of us. Any one person, any one nation, any one alliance, any one university. No one of us is as smart as all of us thinking together. So I'll close with the vision statement of Wikipedia, which is very simple. The vision statement is a world in which every human being can freely share in the sum of all knowledge. A world in which every human being can freely share in the sum of all knowledge. My thesis for us today in this turbulent 21st century is that by thinking collectively, by building bridges, we can create the sum of all security. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you. Thank you.